It's a real feeling that in just 2 weeks, it'll be the last time I'm going to be walking through these halls. I've been here at this hospital, at least one of the hospitals here, for such a long time, the majority of my life. So it is kind of a funny feeling to be at the end of that. My name is Dr. Paul Holtom. I started in this hospital as a medical student 48 years ago. Just incredible to me that that's true. And with a short break in service when I was with public health, I've been here through this time. I'm in infectious diseases. I'm the chief of infectious diseases here at the hospital. I've worked as a hospital epidemiologist. When I started out as a resident in 1980, I participated in the care of the first patient who was admitted to this hospital with a disease that nobody quite understood, but had just recently seemed to have been described at UCLA and eventually became known as AIDS. My career began as the AIDS pandemic began, and during those years it was terribly tragic. We saw so many young people who came in for whom we had no real effective therapy. So many deaths, so many tragedies during that time, very difficult period of time. I was going to retire back in summer of 2020. But unfortunately, the winter of 2020 happened, and with all that happened starting in February, that is the COVID pandemic, it just seemed like a singularly bad time to leave. Saw so many patients where we had often little to offer them, and so many sad times. But I felt, how could I leave the hospital? We had some new people in my department. It was a time that it was all hands on deck. We all had to be doing everything. Very challenging time. But I'm an infectious disease doctor. I had already lived through one pandemic, but the opportunity to do another pandemic, my goodness, I had to stay. To hit 2 pandemics in a lifetime, not many people get to say that. You're not scared of infections that much if you actually go into infectious disease. I suppose that's my profession, so I shouldn't be scared that much. As I said, as an infectious disease doctor, you always expect the worst, so you always protect yourself. But when you see something like COVID, something like AIDS, of course it's scary. Of course it's scary. It's what I trained for, what we're here for. So in that sense, it's, in a, again, somewhat perverse way, exciting that you have an opportunity to really make a difference. And so I stayed on through all of that, but COVID fortunately has become less of a problem now. I have wonderful people in my department who will be able to continue on what we've been doing, and so now seems like an ideal time to step down. But over the last 48 years, there have been so many cases that have touched me in so many ways, both happy and sad. I kind of think back to perhaps one of the patients that I cared for who had multiple traumatic injuries and had infections, obviously, because I was involved and was in the hospital for a very long period of time. A young man who had a young family, who was coming in and always there. But as I think about him and his course, because we got to see him for several years after he was out of the hospital, and fortunately he did amazingly very well. I think back to the long period of almost 2 months that he was in the hospital, but what really strikes me is the time that I was spending with him on the ward, but more importantly, the time that all of the staff here were spending with him. And I know that for him and his family, relationships with all the staff, with us as the physicians, with the nurses in particular. He was on a ward that I was in charge of at the time. We had an utterly marvelous nurse who was in charge of that ward. People who really were caring for him, invested our lives in him. I remember, quite unfortunately, after Nurse Kelly passed away, and he came back several months later to a clinic appointment, and we told him that Nurse Kelly had passed away, which was somewhat shocking because it was very quick shortly that she passed away after she was diagnosed, he broke down in tears because of the emotional bond that he had for the people who had cared for him in the hospital. And I think when we see people like that, we put our time, emotional energy into, and then see them actually get out of the hospital, be able to do well. That's just a terribly satisfying experience, personally, as well as happiness that we've seen that people really have been impacted by medicine, but impacted by lives here as well.